All right, folks, we're going to move on to the next section here in Unit 2, which is Lesson 2.11. And this deals with auto layout and stack views. And these are some pretty important tools for designing our interfaces. And this is basically just a series of some basic exercises to kind of get you ready to do the app stuff and to maybe understand the tools a little bit more before we start to use them for doing, like, more real apps, let's call them. All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new Xcode project here. So this is kind of a part of the instruction set. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to create, go ahead and stop our simulator running. I never stopped it from the last one. And I'm going to go ahead and close our current project. And then we'll create a new one. It will be an iOS app. And then I think they tell us what to name it here. Name the project Auto Layout Practice. That's our thing. So let's do Auto Layout Practice. And the name tells you a lot about what we're about to do. And, it implies that we do have these tools available to us that help put the layout in kind of a logical place automatically, right? And it's kind of foolish in many cases not to utilize that. So we got this built now. And I want you to notice here, they're saying click the devices button at the bottom of the canvas to reveal a menu that lists multiple iOS devices. And it says to the left of the devices are buttons for adjusting how the interface, style, orientations, and appearance will be viewed. So I'm gonna show you that little piece here. So I'm going to go back over to Xcode. And maybe you've seen these already and have actually even tinkered with them. That's entirely possible. And if that's the case, I'm glad you did. But let's go here, and I'm going to go to the main storyboard here, and it's down here that they're talking about. So there's kind of like the devices thing where you can see all the different types of devices you're authoring for. But what they're talking about are these other tools that are here. So some of these are for the side panels, right? But there's also these tools that allow you to change your orientation, change what the background appearances, change the accessibility mode for anybody that might be in that kind of a situation. On the other side of the bottom toolbar, you have a series of tools here. So one is the alignment constraints. So this is one of the tools we will be looking at quite a bit. So this is like setting kind of like these global things that are actually pretty important, by the way. You have this little panel here where you can add some of those constraints. And then you also have these like view things here that you can mess with. And then this other tool where we can take something that we've created and add it to a different type of structure. And usually it's an encapsulating element like a stack view or a scroll view or something, right? So these are the things that we're going to be learning about here in this video. And one thing that they do recommend, like, okay, so let's go back here and look at the different devices that we're authoring for. Now, I'm using a certain version of Xcode, and I don't know if they embed that up here and tell you which version it is. Probably, I would assume it's either here. No. I'm looking for like what we do on a PC where it says about, and it just tells you what the version number is. So maybe what's new in Xcode. I think this is just basically Xcode 13 or 14 that I'm running right now. Some of you might be running a newer version. The bottom line is the newer the version, the more iPhone models and iPad models that you'll have here. And what's generally recommended is that you usually are authoring for one of the newer model, usually the Pro version of the phone, as kind of a default. If you know it's going to iPad, or if you know it's going to go to an older model phone, you can select that. But generally speaking, I mean, iPhones are on what, like version 17 now? I forget. I kind of lose track after a while. But you can see that those templates aren't included here. If I had the latest version of Xcode along with the latest operating system, that those would be available to me. But I am choosing the iPhone 14. It is, kind of important to note that, we've been like coding basically for formats that are vertical because that's mostly how phones are used, but you can go horizontal on those as well, right? That is a thing for any of the devices that we're working. And yeah, not to complicate things, but you have to make considerations for both environments, right? And the problem becomes you code for the one and then you flip it horizontal and all of a sudden it's like, oh, that looks horrible. Right. And ideally you want it to look good on both, right? Because you don't know if people are going to flip it one way or the other or how it's going to be. So now they in the book are, and when I say they, Apple in the book are using iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 Pro, because that's what the latest version was when they were doing it. And I'm on iPhone 14 Pro, and I would encourage you to use whatever the latest one is. And now it says the instructions say, right? Yeah, they want us to play around with the list, yada, 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 yada. Okay. Now return to the canvas, and in the portrait orientation, then move the button to the center of the screen. So they want us to basically add a button, and I guess they didn't really clearly say that. All right, so let's go ahead and add a button. So here's a button right here, and it's dropping it on there. That's how they want us to start. And it says use the blue alignment guides to ensure the button is exactly in the center of the view. So we've kind of had practice with this, right? And it kind of, what's kind of neat is, I don't know if you can tell this from watching the video, but when you get close, it kind of snaps into that spot. And so right now I'm dead center in the middle of the view. Now it says switch the orientation to landscape mode. So switch it down here, and then notice where your button sits. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. Not in a good spot, basically. And obviously if somebody switched that way, the button would not be on the screen and they would have a problem, right? And basically what's going on, okay, so we looked at that like gesture recognizer before, where it like notated the X and Y positions. What is really going on is that button is still in the same XY position relative to the top top left 00 point on the screen. It's just the screen has changed, and now that's not the middle of the screen anymore. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make sure that this is in the center in both views, right? So this is kind of a thing. So the way that we do this is we will set constraints, or if you can think of them maybe as rules, right? That will determine where it goes, and that way it will auto adjust to either orientation and be in the correct spot. All right. So in order to get that thing to sit in the middle, so you see it's still highlighted. All right, so we want to go now to the constraints panel down here. So the constraints panel is this one, right? And we're going to add some new constraints. But notice I'm going to click on the alignment, and you notice the little settings that they have here. So make sure your button is highlighted. If it's not, click on that alignment panel, and then notice here it says horizontally in container, and it's set to 0. And if you click the thing, it'll say use the current canvas value, and is that what we really want? And the answer is no, right? If you check this, right, and where do we want to put it? Well, all right, why don't we move this button? So you see I lost it because it's not on the screen. But if I want to move that button And now I've lost it altogether. So the only choice I have is to switch back. Let me switch it back to this mode and see if I can grab the button and move it. And it's not letting me. And I don't know, like you guys are feeling that frustration, right? I can't grab it because it's not grabbable. It's off the screen. All right. So I'm going to go back here. Now I'm going to grab the button, right? And now I'm going to click that alignment panel. And right, I'm going to click each one of these. And what this is going to do is this is going to add the constraint, right? All right. So just to follow the instructions from the book, it says start by returning to the portrait orientation and ensuring the button is centered in the view. With the button selected, click the align button. The second button in the bottom bar. Okay, so we got that one clicked. The pop-up comes up, right? And then it displays a list of possible constraints. And I want you to show there's a bunch of stuff is grayed out here, right? But we do have these two available. Select the bottom two options, horizontally and vertically in container, and then click add to constraints. Once you've added these two constraints, you should see blue lines cross over the top of it. So you can see how that shows the constraint. So now it's kind of pinned to that spot. All right. So here's kind of the point of this. Now that we have that locked in, look at what happens when we switch views, right? So now the button stays in that spot. But more importantly, if I also switch devices, so if I go like to iPhone, you know, I don't know, let's pick one that's different here, 11, you know, it's still there in the horizontal, right? If I switch to an iPad, you know, and then pick an iPad, you know, there's a whole bunch of them, and flip it, once again, we're okay. I'm going to go back to the iPhone 14 Pro here, if I can find it. There it is. And that's the one I'm going to stick with, and I'm going to stay in portrait mode here. All right, so now we just learned a really helpful little trick. So like we centered it on the screen, and we use the alignment tool here to lock in those constraints. Now you notice it's listed, but as the button pops up in this panel here, the constraints that are holding it in place are also listed. And what I like to do is I do like to view these, and you can see I'm struggling with my mouse to get the little handle to appear. All right, there it is. But those are constraints, and those constraints are listed because they're really kind of basically programmatic features, if you want to think about it that way. And if I don't like those constraints, I can come here and individually tweak them, highlight them, change them, or delete them, right? So I can, if I don't like them, I just come in here and I can just delete both of them. So right now the button has a center X and a center Y command. And then if I removed either one, then that would break it, right? But just to show you that you can access it from here once they're created. All right. The other kind of thing is, you know, aside from kind of playing with the different devices and all that, is to create some size constraints so that like that button always not only stays in the same spot, but always stays the same size. All right, so we got that one. So let's try the size thing. Now, if I actually click on the button itself, so if I click here, and then I look at, you know, the size declarations for the button, you will notice that no size is actually declared. And I'm trying to find where that is here. Right. So you'll notice some of the positioning items down here, right? And if you look in the book, so in the book, I'm on page 316 right now, looking at that image. And one thing they're doing right now is they are changing the background color here to system red. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm also going to pause the video here for a second. I got a phone call coming. All right. So they wanted us to change the color to red. And part of this is just really to make it easier to see the button itself. You know, that's kind of the grand point of that. And okay, so now we can see kind of like the physical parameters of the button, where before it's like, I mean, we can see the little handles, but you can't really, you know, see the size of it. So if I want at this point to make the button a very particular size, I'm going to go down now to the constraint panel, right? And these are constraints where I can lock in the size and shape. And I want you to notice right now, like in the book, the author's button is 67 by 60 pixels high. Mine is 75 by 35. You know, it's a little bit different, right? But still, right? It is a particular size. But if I wanted to make my button be 60 pixels high, here's a spot where I can do that. So watch what happens when I hit the tab key here, that I'm constraining it to that particular height, right? If I add that one constraint. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add this, and just because I do want to show you this. So this is being attached now to the button, right? And you can see the height thing. And notice it didn't really change until I kind of clicked out of the whole interface. And now if I flip again, if I flip the screen again, is it sticking to the same size? Well, you know what? We have to hide the button to see, right? So if I go here and take a look at that now, right? So you see that the height is locked in, right? The constraint is here. The width is not. So I could change the width on this, and you can see I'm struggling to do so. And I'm actually changing the height on it too. And then if I flip it, notice how it just that whole process of just going through changing it can break it. So I'm controlling my way back, right? I do want that to be locked in. Now, here's kind of the interesting aspect of this. What if you want the button to change? So you guys notice, like when I flipped here, it wasn't quite as elegant as it was before, right? But what if, like, I'm moving from this size screen to a different size screen, and rather than have the button be a certain pixel height, I want it to be relative to the screen I'm working with, you know? So like, you know, centering is one thing, but if I'm on an iPad, maybe I want a bigger button than if I'm on an iPhone, right? That might make sense. The thing that they're asking us to do now is to click on this constraints button again, and they're really going to point us out to these four things that are listed here, which are the spacing constraints relative to the application as it sits on the screen right now. Now it is centered horizontally and vertically, and the horizontal one is very apparent because it's 159 pixels on both sides, right? It's the same number, right? So you see it. The top and bottom you don't see as well because there's a different amount of safety zone at the top than there is at the bottom, so the numbers are different, but it is automatically constrained to the margins, which are our safety zone, right? So it's centered relative to that safety zone. Now, these can also be changed so that we're also adjusting. And we call this, you know, these are when the space is in front of an object, we call it leading, you know, so the top and the bottom ones would be leading. And then there's trailing, which are the ones that follow. And, you know, you can use whatever terminology you want, but what if we change the horizontal constraints here from 159 to 20? Now I want you to notice what happened. Just by virtue of changing it, this little I-beam here turned red, right? Which means this is changing, right? So this is what's going to be saved, that little red thing, once I hit that button. I also want to do the same thing to the other side. So I'm going to set both to 20, right? All right. And then go ahead and click add to constraints, and I'll notice what happens, right? So now it's constrained to not only being centered, but to being 20 pixels away from the safe zone on the edges of the screen, right? Now, what happens when I flip it? All right, well, the same layout is basically sticking. It's 20 pixels from the safe zone, right? Constrained to a height of 60. But now the button is, okay, this might not be pretty, but you're getting the point though, that we can lock that in, and it's just a matter of experimentation and settings. All right. All right. So after all that work that we just did, by the way, they're going to have us go ahead and actually delete that button. So go ahead and press your delete key. So highlight here if you wish, or you can click on the view and just hit delete. Notice the constraints got deleted along with it, because all the constraints and all the, the centering, it was attached to that object. You delete the object, the constraints go away. Right. So if I were to add that object back, I would have to recreate those. Of course, I can Control Z and go back to where I was. All right, so that was the first step. Now it says add a label from the object library. Let's do that. And to the top left corner of the screen. So they want it like way up here. And you see how it's like falling off the edge. And if you look at the image in the book, they're doing the exact same thing. It's falling off the edge of the screen. Using the add new constraints tool, right? So that's this one.
Before you keep going, can you make the screen bigger, full screen?
Oh yeah, sure thing. Sorry. I can absolutely do that. I'm not going to go completely full screen, but really close.
Okay.
And I don't know if that helps you or not, hopefully.
It does.
Okay. All right, so they want us to go ahead and create constraints with values of 0 on the top, left, and right of the label. Top, left, and right of the label to the view. Okay, so the label is in there, right? We're going to add the constraints of the top, left, and right to be 0. Now, what's interesting about this is notice these were already 0 and the thing's not lit up, correct? Correct. So I'm going to click in here and basically, type the number in just to get the constraint basically to stick and become a constraint. All right, now I'm going to add the 3 constraints, and yeah, it's not, doesn't look good. I mean, but there's a point to this. Now select the label and open the size inspector. Okay, so here's the label. The size inspector, by the way, is the one with the little protractor here. So I'm hovering so you can see that. And then you can see the constraints that we just added. So they actually get listed here, right? And so if you want, you can expand these out, but the whole point is they are listed, right? Trailing, leading. So trailing is what follows, leading is what precedes. So that's the left and the right. And then the horizontal, the top space are also set, right? And the constraints are also listed here. And if you click on the individual constraints, notice you can see the actual values here. And yes, you can change the values here. The other thing that I think is really fascinating about this, and I haven't really delved into this much, is if these constraints are listed here as properties, it also means in principle, you could probably code to them as well. So you can change them with code. Okay, so that's a whole separate rabbit hole. Now, the whole point of this is they're wanting to show you where you can see the stuff. So you can, on the label, see your constraints by going to the size inspector, but you can also kind of examine them in more detail here as well. Right. So they're giving you a lot of stuff here. Like, for example, it says you might be tempted to simply change the value of the top constraint so the distance from the top is equal to the height of the status bar. However, what if later that view controller is embedded in a navigation controller? Label will no longer be covered, but it would then be covered by a navigation bar. So you wouldn't want to change its position basically that way. So you want to kind of do something a little bit more intelligent. It says to fix this, you need to create constraints relative to the safe area of your view. The safe area is displayed in the interface builder as a subview of the controller's primary view. So for example, if I click here, this shows you the safe area. All right. So, and clearly you can see our label is not in the safe area, and it's got to go down quite a bit. All right. So it says delete your current constraints by selecting them one at a time in the size inspector and then hitting the delete key. So they want us to go back to the label, go to the size inspector, and then here you can delete them one at a time. So the point is to show you that if you have constraints, here's one place where you can delete them. You can also delete them from over here, right? And that would be more the way that I tend to do it these days. But yes, you can do it that way. So go ahead and delete those. All right. Now it says drag your label a bit lower so it's below the status bar and can create a constraint between the label's top edge and the top edge of the safe area, add new constraints. All right, so let's take this and move it down. And now what happens, of course, is it shows us where the safe area is. So I'm moving it right to that spot, right? All right, and then they want us to basically set the constraints here relative to this. So let's go ahead and hit the add new constraints thing. So at this point, and I'm finding this kind of interesting, right, is we're in the safe area. This is set to 0. So I'm going to retype 0 here to lock it in. And I want to be really careful that I'm hitting all their instructions really clearly. So I didn't mean to press escape there. I just want to make sure I'm getting all the instructions. Create a constraint between the label's top edge and the top edge of the safe area using the add new constraints tool. Okay, so that's what we were doing right now. All right, so setting that to 0. Thank you. So now we're constrained, and we know we did it right. So it says align top here. So you see the constraint, align top to the safe area. Okay, makes sense, right? Now it says also add constraints for the leading and trailing edges of the label. And I'm not really sure what they want us to set those to. We want the leading to the safe area and the top to the safe area. All right, so I'm gonna, and so I'm looking at kind of like the outcome of it rather than seeing the how to do it part. All right, so we want to create the leading one. So you see how this time I just clicked the little bar, and then we also want to do the trailing, and I don't know if we want to lock it into that amount, and it doesn't really specify. And so once again, I'm looking at the instructions. Align leading to safe area, align top. So we're okay. So this is kind of a redundant thing. So I think I'm finally seeing what they're saying. So now we have the top is aligned to the safe area, but now because that one's already in place, I can add a leading and I can add another top. So watch what happens here. So now I have the top aligned to the safe area, the leading assigned to the safe area, and then we want the trailing. So I added, so one of these is redundant. So now that I know that, I can just get rid of that, and I can go back in here and I can just add a trailing constraint. So let's see if that is listing correctly. And so I'm trying to get it like basically like the book is, but I'm having the problem where mine is being set to the pixel amount here. And this is not what the book is doing. And we want to actually set this. Yeah, and I'm not really sure how to do that. Isn't that, that's kind of interesting. So here's what I'm going to try this again. I'm going to delete it. I'm not sure if I'm just missing an instruction here from the instruction set. But I think, okay. And so, and basically what I think I'm doing here. Okay. So I missed a really critical step. So the one step was that I'm going to make the label fit here inside the safe area. So the leading is set to the safe area. And even if I make the label all the way across, if I add a constraint for the trailing and set it to 0, the point is it should all go to the safe area. So even though I'm pushing it to the edge of the screen, when I run this, it will be forced inside the safe area either way. That's really kind of the grand point of it. All right. So now they're saying, now that you've done that, and you know, so we're not building and running any of this, we're just playing with the controls, is we might run into the fact that we're going to have other types of constraint issues. So, all right. So now they're saying, go ahead and delete this label. So I'm going to come in here, just click and hit delete. And now we're going to go back and we're going to add a button again. So let's do that. We're going to add a button, just throw it on there, and give it 2 alignment constraints, one for center and one vertical center, one horizontal center. So let's just move it in there. And then if you guys remember how to do that, we go here, add those 2 constraints, and now we're centered XY. Right, so those are in place. Now use the add new constraints tool to constrain its left edge 20 pixels from the left edge of the screen and 30 pixels from the right edge of the screen. A little bit different than what we did before. So here we'll go 20. And then I'm going to tab over and do 30 here. And then we'll add those 2 constraints. Right. A little, you know, they're a little different, but there it is, right? I don't know if you guys can see this as well, but there are little like numeric values that are here, and you can actually, like, you know, if you want, you could zoom in on the view and get a better view of that. But there are those little numeric values. And I don't know how well you can even pick those up. I can see them on my screen, and probably like in the Zoom session, I probably have to get really, really, really big to actually see those little values. But it's showing you numerically what they are. So when you have the thing highlighted, you can kind of see them, right? Not a great example, but it could be helpful, right? If you're trying to figure out layout problems. Right? The whole point is the red lines on the screen are showing the constraints. And you know, if you get like zoomed in correctly, you can see the values of the constraints as well, visually, and that can be super, super helpful. All right. It says, okay, so it says red lines in the canvas indicate there's a problem. So the red is not good here. And basically what it says is you've now created 2 conflicting constraints, each of which is trying to dictate the X position of the button. And to see a list of the conflicts, click the red indicator in the top right corner of the document outline. So if you see this, right, now you can see the conflicts that it's picking up. So the red is actually not good, right? That's kind of the takeaway there too. And then when you see that, it indicates, hey, click on this, take a look, let's figure out what's going on here and try to fix it, right? Okay, so it's one of the horizontal constraints says set the horizontal center of the button equal to the horizontal center of the view, and the other says the left edge is 20 and the other one is 30. Since these 2 can't coexist, basically you got to pick one and get rid of it. So from the conflicting constraints list, click the red error indicator at the top right, right? Select the constraint that centers the button and then click delete constraints. So centers it left to right. We're going to delete that constraint, and now the conflict is gone, right? And so it is centered 20 pixels from one side, 30 pixels from the other side, and that's how it'll just appear, right? So once in a while, it says here in the book that you're going to have these issues and you're not going to be sure how to do them. And really what has to happen is you have to think logically about what you're doing. Centering is one that often can be conflicted because you make design choices later for a reason. I don't know what the reason would be to have a different value here, but just figure in the app, there's a reason for it. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of like messing with this and playing with it before you get like the right thing. Just kind of what I'm trying to point out. Now, if I take this button, here's another issue that can happen. And I'm like, you know what? I don't want the button here. I'm going to move it. Right. And I'm just going to move it down the screen a little bit. All right. Well, this is going to create a different issue. And I want you to notice now we have a layout warning and look at, this is where it's supposed to be constrained to the dotted box. Now we moved it. Now we have these like weird, like yellow kind of, well, they're red, I guess, yellow, red, orange, something like that. And what they're trying to point out now is now you'll see a little indicator up here, right, about that. And it's basically telling you that, hey, you know what, this is what we're expecting, and this is what the actual is, right? All right. If you want to fix this, okay, so this is where it gets a little bit. It says to adjust the button's position to fit the constraints, select the button on the canvas and then click the update frames button. So, all right, so select the button on the canvas, right? And then down here, see this little button, this is the update frames button. You click that and then it'll put it back to where it's supposed to be. So, okay, why this is useful, and this should be common sense. Hey, I was doing some stuff and I selected a couple things, then all of a sudden I clicked and dragged, and all of a sudden my button's moved and it's broken. So if it's got a constraint on it, the beauty of this tool is I can then just click the object that's out of place and then use this little tool here to put it back where it's supposed to be. And very, very useful little mechanism there. All right. The next thing it says that we want to figure out how to do is how do we set up a constraint between multiple objects on the screen. So if I have like two objects on the screen anyway, I always want them to sit together in a certain way. How do I do that? I mean, we figured out kind of the centering and the other stuff, right? So let's do that. Let's go ahead and start by, once again, we're going to delete the button that we created. So we're going to highlight it, make sure it's selected, and then just hit delete. Yes, all the constraints went away too. You can go back to your structure area here as well. All right. Okay. We're deleting the button that we just added to the screen. Now we're going to add a label. And it says double click the label and type in your name. So there's my name. And then it says drag, once you've done that, drag the label near the top of the view. So I'm going to do that. Let's drag it up there. That's pretty good. They do want us to center it horizontally. So I'm going to, there it is. Okay. All right, so now with the label selected, so I'm going to select it from the sidebar this time. And sometimes I do this just because I think it's a little easier to select it, like if it's kind of small, right? And then add the new constraint of, so click the button down here, to be 0 pixels from the top. So I'm just going to click the little I bar right there to make that happen. And then add the one constraint. So align top to safe area. Well, that's good. Now use the alignment tool to align the horizontal center of label with the center of the parent view, right? So we're going to come down here, all right, and add that constraint. So we're adding a horizontal centering constraint. All right. Now, this is now centered, and when they say to the parent view, that means like the safe area of the main view that we're in right now. So we're locked in to be attached to the top and in the center. Now it says with one label set, you can go ahead and add a second label, and let's get that here. Right, so we're going to add a second label, and where do they want us to put it? So I'm going to read the instruction here. And base its position on the position of its sibling. Drag another label from the object library onto the view just before the existing label. And I'm taking a look at their image here. Just want to make sure I'm doing it correctly. Drag another object just below the existing label. Enter some information about yourself. Hey, it's me. I don't know what to type, so that's what I'm typing. Perhaps one of your favorite hobbies, whatever. Now assume you want the new label to have the same horizontal as the first label and to be positioned 20 pixels below it. With the new label selected, click the Add New Constraints button. And in the popover, enter 20 into the top text field. So we're going to type 20 there. The I-beam term's read automatically because we're changing it. And then add the constraint. All right. So now it's constrained to be 20 pixels below. Now, do we want to center it? Sure, you can center that object too. So I can do a horizontally. So I can add that constraint too. So now it's centered and pinned to 20 pixels below. All right. And I think, you know, they're trying to drive us here to make mistakes so that we can fix the errors, right? And I think we just took care of it. So like we weren't centered horizontally and it was recognizing that. So like, for example, if I remove this, right? And I want you to, so this is kind of interesting because these constraints are labeled to the object. So it's like, so the first object is constrained. The second object is constrained. But if I didn't have this, right, so I could remove that one constraint and then I could move it. And once again, notice how it like popped out of position. So the one, I could fix the 20 pixel thing. But it also is saying that we need constraints for the X position. So this one, so add the missing constraint. What's the missing constraint to put in? So this is what I get curious about. Did it do it correctly? Not necessarily. This and this is kind of the weird thing, right? The leading area here, that's not really correct, right? What I really want to do with that one is I do want to center it horizontally. So we would do that here. Right. And then that should fix it. Now, I do you guys notice I kind of intuitively just did that? But the point is once again, if you errantly move it and you want it to be 20 pixels apart, or if you want it centered, when you start like aligning one object to another, what this is telling you is it's kind of intelligent, and it says, well, hey, this one's centered and you want to be 20 pixels below it. Don't you want to be centered too? You know, because right now, like if we flip the screen, it might not look good if you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of making that recommendation. Now, what you could do, and if you want to practice this, and this is what the book does, is you could have another label thrown in, and I could also add a constraint to that one, so that one's also 20 pixels from the previous, right? So you see how it fixed, but that one also needs to be centered, right? And this is just kind of the procedure. So if I wanted a bunch of stuff put on the screen here and I want it evenly spaced, these are the procedures, right? I want to create a top constraint of 20 pixels, right? And I want to center it both. And yeah, that way I could put stuff on the screen and it will line up beautifully. It will be evenly spaced and look good. I mean, that's, you know, you want your app to look good. You know, so these are how you do it. All right. The other thing that they do is they kind of point out the fact that it's like, okay, well, if I had to like put 20 things on the screen, right? And all of them had to be constrained to 20 pixels away and centered. I mean, it's kind of a repetitive process, right? So I'll do it one more time, right? Just to kind of practice it here. Label, top constraint is 20. We'll add that constraint. So there it is, but you know, now it needs to be centered, etc. You know, so it's a repetitive process. If you had to do it 100 times, you would get very bored very quickly. So, all right, what if, okay, so you've done all this work and you got all this stuff up on the screen, and then later you go, you know what, 20 pixels isn't enough. I want to make it 30 pixels for between all of them. Okay, so what's your fix? You got to go into each constraint and change it, and then more importantly, you know, you got to do it in some sort of a system, right? Because if I change the top one by 30, everything will move down. But if I change the bottom one to 30 and then change the other one above it to a different number, I mean, it could really create kind of a mess that could be problematic. You know, what if, you had some other layout things that you wanted to do? There is an approach that you can use that kind of streamlines kind of like grouping all these objects together. We have this tool called the stack view, a very popular one to use in app building. And what a stack view does is it's kind of a encapsulating element that allows you to manage either a row of stuff or a column of stuff, and arranges them based on the properties that we have determined, basically. So the first thing that they want us to do is to take all the labels that are on the screen and select them all. So you can just drag around them like this, or if you wanted, you could come over here, click, and command click all of them. So all of them are selected, right? Then the bottom right button here, right, is the embed button. And here we can make these into a stack view by simply clicking this. All of the stuff we want in there is selected. And now I'm going to click stack view. And now, well, it dropped it all in. Yeah. And it kind of broke it, sort of, right? But now it's inside this thing, right? Now, this does, okay, so if you didn't notice in the sidebar here, okay, so I'm just going to show you, here's the 4 labels. What happened to the constraints? Okay, well, it's saying, well, hey, since you're putting it in this other structure, those constraints are off the table because those constraints were relative to the safe area of the whole app. Now we're inside of a stack view, which is a separate object, and any constraints that we add are going to be relative to the stack view itself. So in other words, I can put all the stuff in here, and the spacing I determine or the positioning I determine inside of here will all travel with this stack view. And therefore I could pick up all of it and all of its constraints and put it somewhere else, you know, like collectively. All right. That might not make sense to you now, but it really is kind of a very, very useful thing. Okay. So we want to make sure that our stack view is selected, and it is selected right now. You can see it. And now we're going to go to the add new constraints panel, and we're going to set the top, the leading, and trailing edges of the stack view to 0. So the top one's already set, but I'm going to hit the bar to lock it in. This is going to be 0, and this is going to be 0. All right. The other thing that they want us to set, so before you go clicking the add constraints, I mean, you could have done it already, not a big deal, is we also want to set the height of this to be set to 300. Now, in the book example, they added a few more labels than I did, right? So they had more stuff in there, but that's okay. I'm going to set this to 300. That means regardless of what I do, the height of this is always going to be 300 as well. And now we have 4 constraints that we're going to add. All right. We're going to add the 4 constraints. And then we're also if applicable, you could add the update frames button, but it's not applicable at this point. Man, it does make it kind of break in a sense, right? We didn't have a width set for this, right? And what I think is pretty fascinating about this, and I'm not sure why this label is different. And frankly, I'm going to go take a look at its properties. It is only set to one line. Why is that one so much taller? Did that get set to 300? So I think that we have. Yeah, these all seem to be okay. I'm not sure why that one is as tall as it is. So
Well, mine's kind of the same as well.
yeah, I'm not sure what the reasoning is for that, but I'm going to just call it normal because I think what's happening is we gave it more space than what it needed, so it's trying to fill that space with something, and it's just choosing the top label. All right, so now it's kind of doing this thing. It's saying, so I'm on page. Let's see, what page am I on? I'm on page 334 right now. It says, now that you have all your labels in a stack, you can learn how to manage the stack and define the positions of its subviews. But before you begin, set the background of each label to a unique color. This will make it clear how your adjustments are affecting the interface. So I'm going to take the first label and I'm going to just, I'm going to do different backgrounds on all of them. So, pick some colors. And try to make them different, We're not looking for beauty here. We're just looking for functionality. Maybe like a red is good. Okay, so I got all different colors. Now it says select your stack view from the document outline. Open the attributes inspector to reveal 4 main properties. Go ahead and explore these attributes, making adjustments along the way. Axis determines, and I'm not sure why I'm not seeing this. Axis determines whether the elements in the view are stacked vertically or horizontally. Okay. So we got horizontal. Okay, well, that's interesting. Or vertical. I think vertical is what we want. Alignment. All right, so we can fill. And I think this is what they want us to do here, is they just want us to play with this stuff, right? Interesting, right?
It is.
And I'm not really sure. Okay, so they are giving us some directions. It says, so it says for fill, alignment describes, you can choose one of the following. Fill, each one fills the size of the stack. Leading goes to the left, center goes to the center, trailing goes to the, and leading and trailing can be different depending on if you're horizontal or vertical, by the way. So I think we played with all of those. So it says the distribution defines how the elements are distributed within the stack view. So we did that. And then they talk about all the different settings. So once again, play with those. Spacing determines the amount of space between each element in the stack view. For example, you can change the spacing from 0 to 20 to add 20 points of spacing between labels. But I think because our overall size of the stack view is set to, I think, 300. So if I click here and go here, and we're set to 300, maybe if I drop this, I'm just guessing here, to 250. right? There you go. And then we can go back here. You can like play with these. And you notice it does just, it tries to just line things up as best as you can, right? The spacing is right now set to 20. And we could, you know, adjust that. But notice, did you notice a little drop down says use standard value? And I'm not really sure what the exact standard value is, but apparently Apple has determined what the standard value is. So you could, for example, do that. And notice it just automatically went to that. I'm going to switch this back to 20 because they did want us to put it there for a reason. Now it says, now try adding, you know, now that we've goofed around with everything, try adding new labels to the stack. All right, so let's go here, create a new label, and let's throw it in. And notice what's happening is it's choosing a spot for us where it's going to go. I want to put it underneath, right? And notice what it did with the spacing. I'm just going to do it again, right? Just to show you. And this one I'll add, you know, here. And notice how it's just taking the space that's available, just automatically applying all the attributes to it. So it's centering it, it's adjusting the spacing automatically. And I think what they're trying to show us is we will get to a point where we add so many, and then we're just going to keep adding them, that what happens to the actual space inside of here? Well, eventually we notice what happened is we ran out of space, right? So this is, you know, kind of like the point of some of this is in the stack view, you know, we could increase this value, but apparently we've hit the 20 pixel limit and now we're not seeing everything. So I could come here and actually just change the size of this, right? So notice now all the labels appear, right? And I think it's really fascinating how it behaves, basically. And they strongly recommend that if you have a bunch of things and you want them to look nice together and you want them to work well together on the screen without having to go in and set a bunch of constraints, it's better to do this, to create a bunch of stuff and put them in a stack view where you can control everything together rather than putting a bunch of individual things on the screen and controlling each one separately, right? You could see how that could be a nightmare. So that's really kind of the grand takeaway from that. All right, we're going to keep moving on here. I'm now on page 338 in the book, if you guys are following along. There are a number of other little topics that we're going to cover here, but I'm just kind of loosely reading from the book here right now. It says, so since we have so many different screen sizes that we can use, there is kind of a couple things that happens that adds some complexity to this, right? Not to make it more difficult. And it says, when you're building an interface, you should really think about all iOS devices. That would be iPhones and iPads in both orientations. One thing that's kind of challenging on an iPad is an iPad has the ability to do a split screen feature, which I'm not sure if iPhones can do that. I think that they do, but I don't own one, so I really don't know. So we have a bunch of different like sizing things that we use that we call kind of like the normal way to do it. It is really so the point is, even though that there is kind of like a regular width and a height for iPads and let's say an upright or sideways format, when we do the split screen thing, we can lose up to a third of the screen. So you have to kind of accommodate that. So they have this little tool basically that helps to support the layout button, which is down here at the bottom of the screen. Right now it is grayed out, right? So it's this button down here, which is the layout button. So if I'm working, for example, on the iPad and I pick one, it gives me the ability here to change the layout relative to splitting the screen. So if that's a concern, that's how you access that. It may or may not be. It just depends on the kind of app you're building. But if you're thinking about the fact that like a user has the ability to take the iPad screen and split it and run one app in one part and one app in the other, you might want to accommodate for that if you suspect it would be used that way. So now they're doing this thing called vary traits, which basically says that the properties can all be set to different values, but suppose you want a stack view space in the property to be 0 most of the time, but when you run on regular width and height, it should be at least 20. You can actually add these in and set its spacing to that using the plus button. So if you highlight the stack view and you're looking at the attributes inspector, right, there is this little panel here on the side for spacing. So if you click that and open it up. So I'm trying to like operate the book and the Xcode at the same time. It's not very elegant, by the way. And it says set the spacing to 0 first. All right, so I didn't do that first. Set the spacing to 0 first. Then bring up the panel and then click which gives us a bunch of variations here. So I'm sorry that I keep losing it. But notice right now, this is set to compact. And what we really might want to do is actually set it to regular, right? And this is the setting that they're using in the book, right? So let's click that in. Now notice as I add that, now we have a different set of constraints here that we can, and they're not just different spacing elements. So in other words, depending on the view that I'm working with, I can set up another thing here to accommodate for those weird views, right? Now you can test this if you want. I'm not like super concerned about it. Now I'm kind of digging into like the tail end of these labs here. And I think I'm going to cap the video right here at this point, but there is kind of a fun little lab. And this is really a very classic programming exercise. And you know what, if we had more time, I would totally make you guys do this. But a real classic programming exercise is to create a calculator. And you know what? It's really easy to do in iOS. I'm not going to do a build on this here right now because we're going to focus on the Apple Pie app for next time. So here's my challenge to you is if you want a little bit of extra work to do or you want to try this out, you can very easily create the interface for this. And I think what's kind of fun about this one is it has you practice all the little containers and constraints and stuff that we just talked about. The code behind it is actually pretty simple. So this is a nice little walkthrough. And the reason I'm kind of showing it up on screen, if you guys wanted to do the build on this, go for it. What we are going to do when we get back together next time is we will work on this build. But if you're looking for extra work, try to do the calculator. Of course, you guys realize that your iOS travels with the calculator already, so you don't really need to build one. But it is a fun little app to build because the code is not that complicated. It's more about the interface elements than the code behind it. So it gives you a lot of practice in that regard. If we do find that we have enough time in the semester, I might circle back and do this one. I don't think that that's a realistic expectation. So this video is going to end right here, and our next one will go into the build of the app.